What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it is time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend for the weekend ranked event. So let's start things out like we always do. We are on gudex.com, set to God popularity at Mythic rank over the last 7 days. And this week is kind of interesting. For the past like 8 weeks, Nature's been on top, like roughly 36 to like 39% of the meta. War has been second at like 20 to like 24% of the meta. But as you can see, right now Nature is 28.8% of the meta, and War is 27.2. So War is encroaching on the top slot, which makes sense because War is the top dog right now. So we've been used to running into a lot of War every weekend, but War will be even more prevalent this weekend. I imagine this number goes up, like, as we hit Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So we definitely got to think about War for this weekend. But now that we've talked about that, let's just jump into the general archetypes for each god. Nature is generally mid-range nature, leaning towards aggro. War can be aggressive Slayer War. However, the new mid-range control-y Valka's Presence War is becoming way more popular because it is super strong. It is definitely the top deck in the meta. Death is usually zombie, but sometimes board wipe death. Both decks are pretty good, but board wipe death is super strong. However, board wipe death is super expensive, so not particularly prevalent in the meta. Magic is generally like spell tempo magic or like ramp magic. Deception is, who knows, could be sleep deception, could be guild, could be hidden rush, could be mid-range control. Deception is roughly 10% of the meta, and it could be anything. So you're going to want to have your GU Dex page open to Google whatever your opponent's playing. And then Light, always Zoo Light. Light's easy to remember. So now let's jump into some of the decks we might want to play over the weekend. Alright, so the first deck we're going to talk about is the deck that won the weekend ranked event from last week, which is Dragonstorm's mid-range control war deck. Like I just said before, mid-range control war is currently the top archetype. It is super strong. Check out last week's video. I gushed about how great this archetype is in great detail, so I'm going to be a bit more concise when talking about this deck. It's super similar to last week's. One difference that you might note is now there is Jason. A lot of the top players have removed their avatars of war in favor of Jason, just because Avatar of War is obviously great, but Jason's just more cards. 3 expensive cards better than 1 is what most people have come to the conclusion of. And another thing that you may notice is this deck has no Demogorgons, which is definitely questionable, especially considering Hector is such an important card. You still have a little bit of leech in your 1 copy of Nakvi Pillager, but you really, really want your Hector to have leech. Evidently, Dragonstorm had no problem getting his Nakvis. If you wanted to throw in demos for more leech in the deck, it definitely wouldn't hurt. Same thing can be said for that Chimera card, the recently buffed. It's a 3/4 with blessed and leech. That you might want to throw in there for some more leech stuff. But this deck did go 25 out of 25, and it's super strong. So maybe 1 Nakvi is totally fine. But so it's lacking in demos, but it makes up for it in other ways. And one thing that it has that a lot of control, mid-range control war decks didn't have is Tartessian Improviser, which is actually a super strong addition to this deck. Obviously, it's super good with Out of Its Misery and buffing any blitz creature. For example, Orcish Elite would have 5 attack, which means it can take out 2 overgrown rhinos just on its own. That's pretty broken. But where Tartessian Improviser really shines is in combination with Archangel Bruiser. We've all pulled the Archangel Bruiser off Out of Its Misery, for the 8 attack Bruiser. And when it's that big, it usually just acts as another full board clear with the benefit of also being a large creature if it lives. And Tartessian Improviser makes it so this creature can have 7 attack relatively frequently, and then it acts as another full board clear, which is super strong. But besides that, this deck is super strong for all the reasons we talked about for the last couple of weeks. Lots of cheap blitz creatures that control the board, as well as relics. You have tons of healing with Grand Hall. Grand Hall doesn't have leech as far as Hector is concerned, but it does have It does have leech, effectively. It itself is a 3/5 with leech in frontline, so that's bound to heal you for a bit as well as slow down your opponent. and it buffs up all of your existing creatures so they can trade even better than they would have and heal you in the process, which is super important for these decks that like to go to the late game. Then you have, really strong immediate impact cards like the Orcish Elite we talked about a bit already. Herdicus, super big creature, kills a creature immediately upon play, so super high impact. And then there is the biggest card in the deck, arguably, which is Soul Survivor. This card was buffed relatively recently. It buffs a creature for +5 attack, and then it deals its strength to all creatures on the board. So it is like mega powerful. It's if you hit any creature, even something as tiny as a Leviathan Hunter or a Tartessian Improviser, it's usually a full board clear. And if that creature was already on the board, it's also a ton of damage to your opponent's face. It's just super strong. It's one of the cards that's like really separating War from all the other gods in terms of power. And yeah, Soul Survivor is really strong. So when you're playing against War this weekend, when your opponent has access to 6 mana, you can't let them stick any creatures. It's like playing against Light and Canonize. When War has 6 mana, they are not allowed to have creatures, or else they will totally win. Let's see, what else do we have to discuss? Oh, one thing that is important. So, like, we've got Jason in this deck. There's no demos, which is great for, budget players, but there is Jason, who is super expensive. But War is like a lucky god in the sense that they have like a pretty cheap Jason replacement. If you want to swap out the Jason and put in Strength in Numbers, which is a Trial of the Gods spell, it's a 7-mana spell. It fills your hand up with 4 random War creatures and gives them +2 attack. So it fills the same, general niche as Jason in the sense that it's like a slow tempo turn the turn you play it, but it gives you a whole bunch of like big strong value cards that you can play afterwards for like, your big value push in the late game. So if you really want to play this archetype, you have most of the cards, but no Jason. Strength in Numbers is your out. And yeah, that's it. Mid-range control war, strongest archetype around. If you've got the cards, play it. You'll get tons of wins. And now let's move on to Board Wipe Death, another one of the strongest archetypes in the meta right now. This is the exact same list that we showed off last week. Grandmaster did well with this deck yet again, and just like I said last week, I am not a huge fan of the Board Wipe Death archetype. I think it's rather boring, but I think this is like a really fun, interesting take on the Board Wipe Death. Instead of having big beat sticks like Poly or Hippocrates Monster, it intends to mill its opponent, and it utilizes cards like That Which Aches to guarantee that Grandmaster or whoever is piloting the deck can't die in fatigue. The little creatures that That Which Aches makes, the Aching Disciples, they're 3/1s. Their effect is Roar, draw a card, and their afterlife shuffles it back into the deck. You can kill them off yourself with your Blood Ritual God power. So if you generate a couple little Aching Disciples, you can guarantee that you never lose in fatigue. And then he just has tons and tons of card draw. Got the Wind-Up Roller for some symmetrical card draw, the Burrowing Scarab, the V-Rocks. Canopic Hoarder can activate those cards I just talked about and make them draw even more. Half-Life can get those draw cards, although Half-Life probably wants to get Fanatics and Avas as well. And then you have Sulfuric Rain, which, is effectively like a slightly weaker Ragnarok, but it makes your aggro opponents draw a ton of cards. And then you end the game the same way all death decks end the game with either Neferu, Apocalypse Now Demo, maybe a big value card with Jason. But if he's in those control matchups, he can totally mill his opponent and guarantee he comes out on top with the That Which Aches. So just like I said last week, this is a really cool take on Board Wipe Death, and it is totally a winning deck. Grandmaster has played 187 games, ton of games, 84% win rate, and as far as I know, he's come in the top 10 at least twice with this exact list, so this deck definitely wins. And as far as Board Wipe Death decks are concerned, this one is really fun. So yeah, if you are a big fan of Board Wipe Death, you have the cards to, you have the collection to make this deck, then it's definitely a contender for what you should play. Alright, so now that we've talked about some of the more expensive archetypes, let's move on to a more cost-effective one in Zoo Light. This deck is very similar to last week's, like we discussed before. Zoo Light has sort of shifted into this extremely early curve, like crazy minion spawn deck in order to make use of Radiant Dawn, which is definitely their most powerful card. Buffs their entire board +1/+2, and if they're asleep, it wakes them up. But the +1/+2 is super important. The +2 health is great because Light has so many health buff cards. So once you get the chain of buffing going, the Light's board state becomes incredibly hard to deal with. And one thing that's interesting about this light build is it runs one copy of Protective Benediction, which is a super strong card that has not been seeing a ton of play recently, mainly because of Radiant Dawn. Since Radiant Dawn buffs all your creatures' attacks, usually your 2-attack creatures were becoming 3-attack creatures and making Protective Benediction useless. But now that we've lowered the curve and we're emphasizing these like spawny creatures, Card Shark, 1 attack makes 2 creatures, same thing with Wicked Fae, your buffed creatures from Radiant Dawn are becoming 2-attack creatures, which means they are back to being buffable by Protective Benediction as well as Asterius. And that's what really makes this deck shine, over some other early curve light decks. So, let's go over all the 1 and 0 attack cards that, you can make use out of the Radiant Dawn Protective Benediction combo. You got the Card Shark that we already scrolled over, that's super good, 2 creatures for 1 card. Trial Spirit becomes a skeleton heavy when buffed by Radiant Dawn. That's always great. Wicked Fae, same as Card Shark, 2 bodies to get buffed. Blind Martyr can get buffed by the Radiant Dawn and then also buffed by Protected Benediction. This is the biggest one. Your Pacifist is one of your strongest cards just in general. It's super great for being, having its attack buff, considering its health is pretty much infinite, especially considering you have, stuff like Blind Martyr to buff its health, and just all these little spawny creatures to make your Pacifist just go nuts really, really quickly. And when you buff your Pacifist up to, 2 attack with your Radiant Dawn, it's just the perfect target for Protected Benediction. And, I guess one thing that's important to note is Protected Benediction, it sort of lies to you. It says pick 2 options, right? That's not true. You always pick armor, and then you make some other choice. So it's armor and then whatever is necessary. But don't screw around and pick not armor. Sometimes you need frontline, but you always want armor. Armor is the best protective keyword, and you want to pick it every single time no matter what. And so besides that, we've got the Cerns. That's in all the great light decks. All these creatures have super high health totals, considering you have the 2 copies of Holy Enchanter, the 2 Blind Martyrs, and the 2 Radiant Dawns. Everything has high health, which means they can take lots of value trades. Then you heal them up with Cern, draw a whole bunch of cards. We've also got the Manosian Infiltrator, which is super good at destroying Pyramid Wardens, as you can tell from his card art. It's also nuts against all these 0 attack structures. If you are unaware, when you set a creature's health equal to its strength, and its strength is 0, the card just dies. So this gets rid of All-Seeing Spires, it gets rid of Monolith of the Storms, provided they have 0 attack at the time. You get the picture. It can be super strong. It's very helpful for dealing with Curse Obelisks, although your Lights Levies do a pretty good job of that, on its own. But all in all, this deck is super strong. It builds a board really, really quickly, and then it just keeps capitalizing on it with Radiant Dawns, with Holy Enchanters, with Protected Benedictions, and eventually Asterius to completely end the game. Light is a really strong archetype, and it'll finish the weekend ranked for you really quickly too. So if time is an issue for you, then Light is even better. Alright, next up we've got Dreadnought's mid-range nature deck. And this is big news, because as of this moment, Dreadnought is currently 17-0. That's right, 100% win rate. This deck is literally unbeatable. And it makes sense. The deck is really great. It's got the classic mid-range stuff that we know and love. You've got the Marshwalkers, low-hanging fruits to buff the Marshwalkers, as well as Chirons to buff the Marshwalkers. Then you've got the Finian Fruitbear, as well as his favorite relic, Fey Flameblade, to not only, deal with your opponent's board, but guarantee your Finian Fruitbear gets to activate on curve. And, like we say every single week, Finian Fruitbear is mega nuts. It's so many stats for 2 mana. The little creatures he makes more stats. Early game stats are really important for, like, a mid-range creature-based deck. The card's just perfect. It's, like, the perfect thing. Underbrush Boar, he's a no-brainer. Super high-tempo tool. Celestial Stag is just great. Decent-sized body, blessed in the early game is fantastic, and it generates you resources, which is nice considering the curve is relatively low, and you might, be in situations where you want to spill all your stuff. Lightning Strike, great single target removal. Selena is really strong. She gets rid of Confused on all of your creatures, like your Brazen Mooses and your Giant Pangolins. And, her ward and backline makes her difficult to remove. She gets to deal 2 damage whenever she wants, and she confuses your opponent's creatures, which is, like a nice little cherry on top. Falling Star, we talk about this very often. Falling Star is super strong because it does so much for just one card. It's literally never a bad time to play Falling Stars. If you're ahead on the board, it's a big creature buff. If you're behind on the board, it gets you a lot of stuff and, injures your opponent's biggest creature. It's, just always a good card, super strong. Same thing can be said about Giant Pangolin. This is probably like the most iconic nature card at the moment. It's in pretty much every deck. Because it's super strong, it's got 6 attack, which is a ton. It's got Blitz, so it does something immediately, and has 2 armor, so it's frustrating to remove. And then last but not least, he's got the Hunt for some nice consistent board control action. And in the neutral slots, he has Minosian Infiltrator as well as Pyramid Warden, so he can not only plop down Pyramid Wardens on turn 1 to activate his Finian Fruit Bear, he can also deal with his opponent's Pyramid Wardens with his Minosian Infiltrator, so super strong neutral cards. And before we end it, let's just talk about Chiron one more time in general. Relic removal is super strong in the meta right now. In fact, just going back to that light deck real quick, that light deck doesn't have relic removal. You definitely want relic removal. Like, not only are there, Necroceptors and Kopeshes and light has relics, blah, 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 blah. But if you're a creature-based deck like, mid-range nature, like Zoo Light, then you need to be very cognizant of War and Carnage Sweep in particular. And, sometimes there's no playing around Carnage Sweep. Sometimes they play Leviathan Hunter, pip Carnage Sweep, and you have no chance. But usually they have to set up their relic beforehand in order to Carnage Sweep your board, and it's super important that you can answer their relic before they sweep you so that you can continue to, dominate the board state. So relic removal is super important in the meta right now, and Chiron's just a great card in general. So, great job, Chiron. And yeah, so that is about it for mid-range nature. It is a super strong archetype. Dreadnought's currently undefeated with this list. This might be the heavy hitter that you are looking for. So now let's move on to Magic. We've got the exact same tempo spell Magic deck as last week. This is a very strong deck, super fun to play. It's really good at being both aggressive and defensive. It's capable of super high tempo plays in the early game with your Assistant Alchemist plus Pyramid Warden combos, or just, Assistant Alchemist plus any, 1-mana creature. Super powerful. You got tons and tons of card draw with your Palace's Wand, your Demetrios, and your All-Seeing Spire. All-Seeing Spire is particularly strong. It's hard to remove because of the order, so it requires like a direct spell or, God Power over multiple turns to remove. So it's bound to draw you a bunch of cards. Vortimir, also super strong, great at dealing chunks of damage, usually hits your opponent for 3 and draws you a card every single turn. Then you have cards like your Oni Spell Sword, which just grows exponentially every single turn, does a ton of damage. Miraculous Familiar gets lots of resources. And then, Monolith of the Storm is your big heavy hitter, does tons of damage at one time. However, there's a bit of an issue right now. I would not recommend playing this type of deck this weekend. Like we were saying, mid-range Control War is going to be really popular. It's the strongest deck right now, and they have lots and lots of healing. And generally, this deck wants to chip away at their opponent in the early game, and then kill them right at the end with spells. They got their Worm Breath, their Epiphanies, that aforementioned Monolith of the Storms, and it's really hard to set up 2-turn lethal situations with spells when they can just play Grand Hall and heal up for 15. So, mid-range, spell magic, although fun, although strong, may not be great this weekend because of that, mid-range control war deck floating around. But if you are a die-hard Magic fan, then this is definitely the deck for you. Alright, and the last god that we have to talk about is Deception. This Sleep Deception deck was made by 3 question marks mystery person. And like I said in the beginning of the video, Deception can go a bunch of different directions. You can go Sleep, you can go mid-range control, you can go Hidden Rush, you can go Guild. Deception is sort of like Jack of all trades, master of none god at the moment, because, it has a ton of archetypes, but, are any of them really that good? Not really. That being said, Sleep Deception is probably going to be your most consistent archetype, just because, they really have the tools to be a good control deck. Like we were saying a lot in the first couple of what to play videos, They just have a ton of stall and control cards all throughout the curve. Orfeo himself, he's a great, removal card. This stalls and destroys, this stalls and destroys, this, destroys eventually, this stalls, this destroys. Elixir of the Snake is a particularly cool board clear because it doesn't care about ward. Its effect is totally not blocked by ward, so this card destroys like Highborn Knights, which is, interesting. Not much AoE deals with Highborn Knights. But back to it, this is a full board clear, that's a full board clear. Demo, stalls, destroys, blah, blah, blah. You get it. This deck is really good at stalling and destroying creatures. It's also really good in the control matchups because of cards like Cutthroat Insight. So you can steal your opponent's Hectors, their Polys, their demos, what have you. You've got Ludia's Deception to not only help you filter through your deck, but you can look at your opponent's hand to see if they have one of those juicy cards that you would like to steal with your Cutthroat Insight. So that's kind of convenient. Let's see, for your win conditions, you have the demos, obviously, for when you're in those aggressive matchups against, like, Slayer War or mid-range Nature. Then you've got your Poly, which will kill everybody else. We've also got an Iron Tooth Goblin here. Like I said, for the other decks, Relic Removal is really important in the meta right now. However, Iron Tooth Goblin is in this deck for a different reason than the Nature and Light decks, that we talked about before. Nature and Light need to worry about Carnage Sweeps. Control decks don't really care about having their boards cleared. This one cares about the Necrosceptors, the Palace's Wands, and like the Kopeshes. There's a lot of like infinite value relics floating around the meta, and control decks hate infinite value anything. If they're trying to run you out of resources, they literally can't do it if some of your opponent's cards do things infinitely. So Iron Tooth Goblin is super important for those, Necrosceptors, Palace's Wand, Kopeshes, what have you. But besides that, this is a fairly standard Sleep Deception deck, and it should definitely, get you 18 to 20 wins, no problem. Alright, so we talked about the meta, we went over different deck archetypes. What is the conclusion? What deck will perform best over this weekend ranked event? And that answer is simple. Mid-range Control War. This is the strongest archetype in the game right now. It's good at everything. It's got super strong creatures. It can control the board in the early game. It's got tons of life heal. It's got super strong creatures. It's got board buffs. It's got board clears. It has it all. If you have the collection to make mid-range Control War, it is definitely the strongest archetype right now. But whatever you go with, make sure you have fun. Tell us how you did in the TST Discord and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!